So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to something we haven't seen in quite a while at this point. This is going to be another of these 8-way free-for-alls, and it was worked out how to do this in Medieval 2 a fair while ago in the game at this point. You do need to make a custom scenario in order to be able to do an 8-way free-for-all. So it's something that you kind of have to make your compositions, and then whoever's making the scenario itself needs to then take that into account and give you them. And yeah, it's kind of a strange kind of process for what is ultimately just a standard battle. You know, this in terms of a scenario is very much based around the mechanics of what's actually going to be going on rather than any sort of theme, because of course an 8-way battle is going to be very chaotic at the best of times, and you can see that this map itself is also very arena-like in the way that it's laid out. There are these bridges that dot around the place. There's that maze that we saw as we flew past just a minute ago. There are several natural formations on the battlefield, and it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out, because free-for-alls are very often a matter of politics. They're very often a matter of positioning, and very often actually, if you have a poor early game, you can end up having a very strong late game. But we'll see how this goes. This is very likely, after all, to be quite a topsy-turvy kind of affair. This was sent to me by the Womb Raider, who has sent me a fair few free-for-alls over the course of the past few months. So we'll see how he gets on in this one, considering he no longer has his faithful ally alongside him today. He's going to have to go about his treachery on his own. Fortunately, however, he has picked a very good free-for-all faction in my eyes, because Mirkwood, while they don't have the numbers necessarily to be quite so gung-ho as a few other factions in free-for-all settings, the fact they have so many hidden units available to them, the fact they have a lot of long-range damage, their cavalry also lends itself more to free-for-all fighting as well. I do think that Mirkwood are going to serve him quite well here. The Woodland Realm Axemen, for example, they may be rather basic when you compare them to the other Mirkwood units, still rather damaging but kind of fragile, but the fact they can hide anywhere means that you can always deploy them later on as a late game surging kind of unit. We'll see if that is how they are decided to be used. Sindar of the Girdle, very strong cavalry unit. The only problem they do have is among the multiple HP lance / spear cavalry units, they are a little bit fragile. Ultimately, once their hit points are gone, missiles can be a bit of a problem. You know, their armour is not the best, but they are actually very good against other cavalry in melee, and they don't sacrifice being good against infantry off the charge for that, so very multifaceted. We'll see. Again, everything with Mirkwood, generally speaking, is about how you can use individual units. They can be extremely effective as long as they don't get penned in and their low armour values exploited. Huntsman of Amon Lank, single HP cavalry, the ever closer new patch of the game, is something which, based on what I've seen already, single HP cavalry is going to be a little bit more useful in these settings. But for now, the Huntsmen of Amon Lank really represent everything that's kind of wrong with single HP lance cavalry, in the sense they're not particularly devastating off the charge compared to the higher tier units that they're not that much cheaper than, and very, very fragile as well. But still, we have seen them used well in the past, but it is a risky move to bring them nonetheless. Woodland Realm Patrol, obviously Elven Archers are always going to be capable of dishing out the damage. They don't really want to be getting involved in any sort of bogged down skirmish fight, but I kind of doubt that's going to be the case anyway, because other teams are not going to want that either, so we'll see. We'll see how Mirkwood get on in that regard. Some Emondwyr units, so Spears of Emondwyr, they're basic, out on the open field, which is where Mirkwood have ultimately spawned, in and amongst the rock formations in the middle of the map. Spears can be useful against cavalry, and ultimately in melee, their melee defense is going to make them good against fellow lower end units. But we'll see how they can get on against some of the better units which are inevitably going to be coming their way. Another mounted unit in the Bows of Emondwyr, we actually saw them very recently in the somewhat sloppily recorded, I must say, by my standards, almost Temple free-for-all. We actually saw the Bows of Emondwyr used quite well by the Mirkwood team on that occasion, but Mirkwood as a faction overall, it was a very risky move to play them in that sense. But in an 8-way free-for-all, this is the kind of unit which late on could be very, very decisive. The Hiri Lang with the armour upgrade, so the heavier Mirkwood units are a bit of a mainstay for Mirkwood when we see the standard siege battles. They can't hide, however. They are one of the classes of units that Mirkwood can't sequester away quite so easily, so it makes sense that they're out here in the open field. Woodland Protectors for a bit of javelin action as well, to do a bit of extra damage, and some Spears of Emondwyr. Also the Ents. Now, if they can be committed at the right time, they could be extremely devastating, but these kind of monstrous infantry units in a free-for-all timing is even more important, I would say, than in a siege, because if you use them at the wrong time, they can be a colossal waste of money and they won't really achieve much. But if you can commit them at the right time, it can be the death knell for whoever you send them against. And then the two higher tier units of archers, the Wardens of Amon-Lank, merely a standard high tier unit of archers with an armour piercing and melee attack. The Elders of the Elven King, however, are a bodyguard unit, and it makes sense to bring them over the Palace Guard in this setting, I think, because they're a little bit more multifaceted. And some late game Silverthorn arrows will also be exceptionally useful, I feel. Meanwhile, I think, is this only Gondor? Well, the Warlord, who is playing as Gondor, so we have the Mithrandir's retinue over here. They're going to need to be a little bit careful with the Mirkwood cavalry just outside, and I think there's another faction very, very close by, if not in the maze already with him. We'll see how the Warlord gets on there. Standard Gondor archers, some marksmen of Caer-Andros as well, so if it comes to digging into this little labyrinth and using heavy archers, then Gondor are better placed than most for doing that, especially when you take into account some of their heavy infantry options as well. More of an aggressive infantry option, though, with a fully upgraded Axeman of Lasarnak, giving them that armour-piercing edge to which they would otherwise kind of lack. We also have the fully upgraded Gondor infantry, an efficient unit for their tier, though this is an area where the Western Kingdoms of Men flatter to deceive a little bit, I think. Yes, they are decent for their cost, but very, very rarely are they going to be exceptional on the battlefield, though efficiency is going to be important as this battle wears on, undoubtedly. Pelagia Marines, we also have some Guards of Osgiliath, some Fountain Guard, and some Wardens of the White Tower, so several polearms. This is of course the older version of the game, so the Fountain Guard is still the phalanx unit that they were back in this patch of the game, and the Wardens of the White Tower, of course, a high tier sword and board unit. More Gondorians, including a Trebuchet, which is in a very good position in this labyrinth, in all fairness. If they can start shooting into the units as they pass through the choke points, then it could be very devastating for them. Pelagia Marines, Guards of Osgiliath, we also have the Citadel Guard in and amongst here as well, the armour-piercing spear adding to the armour-piercing heavy axeman, and then some Gondor infantry and more pikes as well. So the Warlord very clearly setting up his army to try and dig into a more defensive location, but he's going to have to deal with T.S. Niehoff, who is already occupying some of the labyrinth as well, and Rhun represent a bit of a problem maybe for Gondor, given their affinity for armour-piercing. The Gamprim may be outranged by something like the Guards of Osgiliath, but armour-piercing halberdiers is always going to be useful. The Flagrim as well, this is one of the areas where they will be able to overcome something like the Gondor infantry, that armour-piercing, all important in that particular engagement. Balcoth Tribesmen as well, a couple of units of Nar Rim. If there is one area in which Gondor should be fairly domineering against Rhun, it should be in archer-to-archer combat. Rhun can try and affect that a little bit with something like the E-Strong crossbows. Not great in a skirmish fight because of how fragile they can be without their armour upgrade especially, but we'll see. More Nar Rim with more stakes, more tribesmen, more clansmen, Flagrim and Gamprim as well. Several units further north as well. E-Strong Guard once again, we have the very deadly Dragon's Wrath crossbows. The body piercing crossbow bolts could be truly terrifying in this sort of environment. E-Strong crossbows, and a couple of units of Scionrim as well, more of a defensive unit, more akin to something you would expect from the Gondorians in all fairness, though lacking the armour piercing of the Citadel Guard, so that does put them a little bit more so on the back foot. But yes, other than that, it's going to be a very quick start to proceedings over here. A bit of cavalry outside as well. I say a bit of cavalry. It's the two high tier units of cavalry, the Dragon's Wrath Warlords and the Carmel's Dragon Knights, the silver-clad unit actually being the stronger of the two, but both of them very, very scary. A little bit slower perhaps than their Mirkwood counterparts, but they should still fancy their chances there. Of course, two multiple HP cavalry units against just the one. Now then, over here in the corner we have Tommy the Wise playing as Imladris, so probably going to be a smaller army overall, though the elves, as we've already seen, plenty of tricks up their sleeve. Standard archers of Rivendell, as well as a unit of Elder Enway archers. I think just over there indeed you can see that, once again, much like in the maze, out here we're going to see a very quick coming together of two forces. The Elder Enway archers pointing the wrong way as well, so Imladris are actually maybe caught out a little bit here, and they don't have an ideal composition, but we'll see. I mean, Harad may not either, in terms of trying to finish off an infantry force. So some Spears of Rivendell and some Swords of Rivendell. Upgraded though the swords may be, this is clearly an effort to save money so that other units can be prioritised, including the Imladris sentries, which is more of a defensive choice once again. This infantry is not going to be a match winner, but it is going to be potentially a real stumbling block for anyone wanting to try and take out Imladris quickly. But it's going to be the cavalry where most of this budget has been spent. The Gwythi Rockdor being the Knights of Imladris. We have the Imladris Sentinels again, single HP cavalry. We'll see if they can actually pull their weight on this occasion. The Eldraenway Lancers we've seen very recently as well in one of Tommy's scenarios actually. They performed well there, though it was set up for them to do so when things are a little bit more different, and also Harad have the drop on them. We'll see if they can perform well there. And some Riders of the Broinin, we've already seen Horse Archers from Mirkwood, and also their Elven brethren in Imladris are also going to bring their own. Now then, Harad, played by Hidden, he has got a couple of units of, again, standard Serpent Guard, so it's kind of neat to see all of this single HP cavalry. I may not be the biggest fan of it in this version of the game, but still, the fact that it's being shown is a good sign, I think. It means that the players are thinking outside the box a bit. The Serpent Guard will need to be quite careful though. Lances down, they can do damage, but against the equivalent Elven units they will struggle a bit, so we shall see. Armour piercing is useful against Imladris, more so than against the other Elven factions of course. Even with that in mind though, stuff like the Southron Warband will still struggle a bit. They will be able to at least punch a little harder before they inevitably perish, but we'll see. A couple of units of them. Some Southron Pikemen just in behind also. Under normal circumstances it would be a really good pick, but considering the amount of Phalanx units Imladris have, Harad are going to have to win this fight by other means. They certainly have the elements of surprise, I suppose, but is that going to be enough? Archers-wise, again, Harad are not really the best in terms of long-range skirmishing anyway, so that's another area in which Imladris will fancy their chances. And I'm talking about this as a 1v1 more so because it's very obvious that one of these factions is probably going to fall away almost completely, if not completely, before they ever encounter anyone else. The Catapult could be one way in which Harad really do catch Imladris out. They have got the opportunity to shoot right down those lines. We have Haradrim Archers, Southron Pikemen, a couple of units of Muhard Beast Hunters, Javelins another area perhaps. And back here we're starting to get in some of the scarier units that Harad often bring. Serpent's Fangs maybe less scary and more dependable at long range, but it's the Trollmen class of units, the regular Trollmen, the Demons of the Desert with their very deadly Javelins, and of course the Champions of Nafarat, the bodyguard version. Loads of armour piercing, loads of upfront power, and given the Imladris composition, there's not really equivalent, really high-end Imladris infantry for them to worry about too much outside of the pikes. And also we have the Black Serpents, which are a multiple HP lance unit. Again, Harad in terms of cavalry want to be very careful about tangling with Imladris here, but the Black Serpents are very quick. They could potentially scoot off somewhere else on the map first and foremost before doing anything else. If we make our way around the outside of the map still, we have Herr Tumihai playing as Umbar. Unsurprisingly, once again, we see the high-tier cavalry prioritised, with the Warlords of Umbar being the more aggressive version and the Alcarondas Faithful being the melee cavalry. Further forward, we can see some Ardenheim Shield Guard. Locked morale can be potentially very useful in a free-for-all because it means you have to kill off those units in their entirety. They aren't going to run away, so it's a way in which Umbar could retain a puncher's chance even in a losing engagement. Corsair Infantry, obviously limited morale, technically yes, limited morale, but limited ammunition. But yeah, they can double as makeshift infantry as well. Balagai Footmen and Pikemen are a way of making a cheap and cheerful front line as Umbar that will kind of do the job, though you have to be a little bit careful in terms of how much quality you back them up with. Alcarondas Legion can fill that role just fine, of course. Corsair Blackguards, very good Javelin infantry hybrids once more. Harbingers and Balakith Axguard for, again, shock infantry. Though the Harbingers, of course, are of a higher tier. Balakith Marksmen, very good in terms of a long-range skirmish, and they're going to have to get down to business very, very quickly because, once again, we're going to see armies deploy next to each other very, very close, and it's actually Mirkwood and an army in the distance there, the Hobbits, that are actually not doing so. The only ones that have not done so. That could end up being very important for them, but Y2K as Numenor is going to have to deal with their unruly offspring in Umbar immediately. Numenorian Shield Guard with some armour piercing will help them do that. Balagai Footmen, of course, clad in blue this time around, so the same unit, only with a different livery, going to be facing off against one another. Naru and Aru Sentinels, if they can dig into a position, they can of course be exceptionally devastating over a long period of time. A Trebuchet in a nice position as well. This may be one of the reasons why Umbar want to beat a hasty retreat here from Numenor, because Numenor have got a good place to dig into. Umbar kind of don't. I think they're going to have to back up and maybe take refuge in the middle, perhaps. They do have a pathway up there after all. Numenorian cohorts, Pharazim Swordmasters, Steel Bows already firing away, of course. That's a lot of damage from those various units of their tier. Seafarers of Nindamos, Balagair archers, yeah, there's a lot of ranged firepower here from artillery and from various types of archers that Numenor have. So even though it's an area where Umbar usually would fancy their chances, I think Numenor, with positioning taken into account, should feel fairly confident. Interesting to see the Alcarondas Faithful as well as the Pharazim Nobles. The Alcarondas Faithful, only a unit you can pick as Numenor if you put it onto all eras. So it's kind of a hidden, quote-unquote, unit. But interesting to see them nonetheless. So 2 melee cavalry units, very much digging into the corner of the map here. And finally, we have the Hobbits. And I imagine we're not going to be seeing too much of them because so much of their roster can hide. Another wily decision perhaps from Medexa here. I wouldn't trust the Moonraider and Medexa as far as I could throw them based on recent free-for-alls that we've seen. But he has got the Ents. He has also got a few units of battling Brandybuck. So armour piercing is something the Hobbits do have, though mostly low-tier armour piercing, it must be said. Even on units like the Banderbrass Archers, they've got an armour piercing melee attack, though first and foremost they are decent archers for their tier. We have the Bjornings, which are a monstrous unit of cavalry, kind of interesting, like berserkers on a mount. Very, very effective early on, but again, kind of like the Mirkwood cavalry actually. They can be exposed once their hit points are gone, though they at least do have more of them. And we also have the Proudfoot Protectors over here, obviously. For me, the most dependable Hobbit unit. Pikes combined with crossbows is a devastating combination at the best of times. Plenty of Ents, of course. They also have the Gandalf's Fireworks, which are marshalling these bridges, though I really doubt that any army is going to be utilising the bridge crossings over here. But yes, I don't know actually where we're going to be starting off this battle. I think we'll head back over to Numenor and Umbar and then head back round the map anti-clockwise rather quickly as this battle gets underway. But I think the early stages are going to be the most violent of this one. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So this battle is going to be an awful lot of flitting around, I feel. We're going to see immediately, of course, as I said, Numenor and Umbar, the two very similar factions that share quite a lot of units, at least at their base, go at one another first and foremost. And as I've said, I think Numenor, based on positioning alone, have got a little bit of an edge over Umbar here, though the two of them going at one another to this extent does maybe introduce a few problems for both of them, because as the battle goes on, of course, it may not be quite so simple for them to have much success. Meanwhile, the Serpent Guard over here immediately managing to charge into the Eldarenway archers, but here you can see the downside of single HP cavalry because they practically bounced off, it seems, the Eldarenway archers. A few kills, but more of the riders actually end up dying than elves there. Which, as much as the Eldarenway archers are strong, getting clattered by a unit of cavalry should do maybe a little bit more damage than that. And now, of course, cavalry on cavalry. Even though the Imladris cavalry is also single HP, they are going to have a pretty clear advantage there. Riders of the Broin in there, so yeah. Harad's cavalry not doing quite so well. And at long range, you would back Imladris here. The superior numbers of Harad suggest that maybe being a little bit more aggressive would be the way forward for Hidden, but we shall see. Meanwhile, we also have over here what is likely to be a little bit more of a grindy fight between Rhun and Gondor. As I already mentioned, this Labyrinth area is an area where both the Eastlings and the Gondorians had set themselves up. But again, the armour piercing of Rhun should stand them in pretty good stead, but this is the kind of terrain where Gondor, with the ability to dig in, tend to be at home, so it's going to be interesting to see how this progresses. The Guards of Osgiliath going to need a little bit of support, but the Warlord does have that. Of course, in a free-for-all, it's more understandable to try and undercommit to a front line, because you don't want to commit too much of your strength in. But if one team decides to go all in here, they could rather quickly overwhelm the other, so that is something worth bearing in mind for both Gondor and Rhun. It does look as though Rhun are going harder into this than the Gondorians are. Meanwhile, Bows Vermanduir. So Medexa and the Moonraider are actually fighting one another on this occasion. Past free-for-alls we've seen, they have not done that. They have been conspiring against their foes on the same team, but this time they are going after one another, so that should be rather interesting. Meanwhile, Numenor and and Umbar have separated from one another. Numenor very much still posted up in the corner though, so that's something that I would be taking notice of if I were the other teams. Initially, Mirkwood and the Hobbits, the ones not really getting involved in proceedings, but now it's the two Numenorian factions that are engaging in that kind of behaviour. Interesting to see Rhun also making an appearance over here, trying to take a few chips out of Imladris as well. Their cavalry not going to be quite so useful in the Labyrinth against Gondor, so instead they're trying to go over here to deal with some Imladris cavalry, but kind of a foolish move that, because the Carmel's Dragon Knights are all on their own. There is the Gwythi Rockdor, who are certainly the match, if not more so, of the Carmel's Dragon Knights, with all the other cavalry units as well. It was always going to end in tears for the runic cataphracts. And over here you can see, settling down into the long game over here, Tommy with his unit shields pointing in the right direction. I mean, I don't know, Imladris don't really want to attack into Harad with all of those high tier units and numbers that Harad do have. Indeed, if I were Imladris, I would be thinking about moving away from this area entirely. It's not really the sort of terrain nor the period in the battle where the cavalry and light infantry focus that Imladris have largely gone for is going to be all that useful. Late on, however, it may very well be. I'm not entirely sure what the Dragon's Wrath Warlords were hoping to accomplish by charging into Imladris sentries. Maybe they're going after the God Halim, and micro upon them was lost. Well, Ents versus Ents, going to be interesting to see that. Spears of Amanduia also. The Hobbits with their armour-piercing focus also not going to be quite so good here against the lightly armoured, for the most part, Mirkwood. The firework launcher, however, is in trouble. Cavalry is swarming about them, and I think the Hobbits were moving their army maybe a little bit too quickly to try and get out of this lower terrain position. Now Mirkwood have got the elevation position in terms of their infantry. Obviously Mirkwood's infantry is going to be superior to the Hobbits as well. And then they also have the cavalry, which only one unit of Bjornings to try and defend. The Gandalf's fireworks are going to have to be used. They're going to get plenty of friendly fire here with the firework launcher, but it's going to have to be utilised now, because the Hobbits, if they allow things to continue as they are, Mirkwood are going to have a victory here, and that's going to be one of the first major losses on the field. I mean, yeah, this is going to be mutually assured destruction from the Hobbit Watcher. I don't believe, yeah, there is now no defence against the Huntsmen, so that's going to be a little bit unfortunate for them. Tookish Hunters and Band of Brass Archers going to try and get into position, but yeah, you can see the artillery is also something which is doing a lot of damage, morale-wise, to the Hobbits as well. Most unfortunate for them, with the heavier Elven units. So yeah, I think this is just a matter of positioning. I think if they had been a little bit quicker, the Hobbits, they could have got into a position that was a little bit more advantageous for them, or if they had maybe taken their time a little bit more, considering the stretched nature of their army, defended their artillery a little bit better, it would have gone significantly more smoothly for Medexa, but it is what it is on this occasion. I think you can see Umbar are now slowly moving their way across to the slow boil of a fight that is taking place between Imladris and Harad. Meanwhile, over here, Gondor and Rhun going at one another. Looks well, the Trebuchet has been killed by Rhun, so I mean that is a sign that Rhun are committing more to this fight, going more all in. Risky, of course, for T.S. Niehoff to do this, because it means that you're going to have maybe a weaker army later on, but it does mean that I think the Gondorians were rather unprepared for this eventuality, and losing the Trebuchet without it seemingly doing much is a significant loss. And you can see most of the corpses on the ground are Gondorian as well, so that's a real sign that Rhun are in the ascendancy here. Gondor still have pockets of resistance here and there. Yeah, it looks as though this Labyrinth fight has favoured Rhun so far, though the lances do come down there for that Gondorian cavalry. Point blank javelin fire, but not before significant damage done to the Balkoth tribesmen, though that's a trade maybe Rhun would take. Maybe not, Mithrandir's rescue's still too healthy, so worth it for that, but stakes are still present, so utilising cavalry within the maze is a little bit risky victory almost a certainty for the flag rim as well. Arrow fire support making the guards of Osgiliath a little bit less effective, so we're seeing more and more of this. So well played so far by Rhun, it seems, but these things can turn around pretty quickly. If Gondor do have sufficient reinforcements, they can turn the momentum back. They've been very content so far, Harad and Imladris, to simply shoot at one another. Samwise getting absolutely lamped in the face there by an elf and then run through off screen. But yeah. Beast hunters getting hit. I mean, certainly the demons of the desert would be one of the targets. I don't know who this suits more. Probably this is what Imladris will want, because I think earlier on when Harad had more of their numbers available to them, overwhelming Imladris was an option. Like I said, in a free-for-all you don't necessarily want to be hyper-aggressive like that, because it still would have cost Harad quite dearly, but it would have given them maybe a foundation to then withdraw in the later game. Now Harad are also very much trapped in a corner, hidden is anything but with her Tunahai and Tommy surrounding him, though you can see that Numenor starting to maybe think about putting some pressure on Umbar as they move, and Umbar as a result is going to turn completely around now, and Numenor are going to scurry back to their defensive position. I mean, this is all well and good for Y2K, but if alliances are formed, they could end up being on the wrong side of a real beating. Now the hobbits are capable of fielding hidden units, as we have seen, and maybe that's the ploy here from Medex, and maybe he willingly threw the vast majority of his army under the bus so that he could then reveal other units later on back in his original starting position over here. It's possible, and if that's the case then you're banking on the late game, which is not a bad idea in a free-for-all, but for now Mirkwood will be very pleased with their day's work over there. Lots of hobbit units being killed off, and now they can move with the bows of Amenduia going to be the first ones to maybe do a little bit of damage to Numenor. I mean, if I were the other teams, I would definitely not be letting Numenor get away with posting up in the corner once again on this hillside. And Umbar and Mirkwood together would be able to overwhelm them. It's whether or not your opponents can set aside their differences. That is the big question when it comes to digging into such a heavy extent working. We will see what fate awaits Numenor. Meanwhile, Imladris now perhaps sensing that Harad have been softened up sufficiently. Also, worth bearing in mind, they know that they can no longer count on the support of Umbar to give them a hand against Harad, so it's going to have to be all their own hard toil if they are to be successful here. Imladris sentries rolling forwards as well. Trollmen on the front line though. See time and time again the massive difference that Trollmen can make to a Harad front line. Further back they still have cavalry as well in Imladris, and moving in from the side. God Halim going after the demons of the desert. Nice charge there from the Gwaithir Raptor as well, managing to thread the needle quite nicely. That's a large amount of damage done to the demons, so I think Harad, much like how the Hobbit army was, they're going to be demolished here, but this is Harad's starting position, so there's no danger of anything being left for them really. Yeah, this is going to be the end of Harad. Maybe not willing to take the initiative early on, and it is going to cost them in the long run. That's going to be the Hobbit general running. What remains is only remnants of a few routing units. Well, there's a few examples now of Rhun struggling a little bit more. Citadel Guard and Guards of Osgiliath as a front line is an effective one. As Mithrandir's retinue cycle back out. Over here, Rhun are still winning in other areas though. Gondor Archers trying to offer their support. Meanwhile, further into the Labyrinth, all of the territory that Rhun have already seized. And continuing to do so, continuing to carry the fight to Gondor, and all of these archers now going to be engaged in melee. Warns of Minister Thiel. That second hit point does allow them to look after themselves in melee, okay, but not when they're isolated against a full runic column. Just in behind, Marksman, Carandros trying to offer what support they can. Gondor don't really have too much else, and of course this as well was Gondor's starting position, they have fewer hidden units as well to work with than the likes of the Hobbits, so it's very unlikely that they are going to be too much of a fixture in the late game, though a single unit can make all the difference. Maybe a unit of Athelian Rangers. Could that be the one? Marksman. Guards of Osgiliath victorious. Going to try and consolidate themselves perhaps. Gondor. Bobbing and weaving their cavalry around the stakes. 13 of them, so they have been busy. Just based on the damage they've been slowly accruing on themselves. Harad going to have too much in terms of quality. Ooh, that death animation. There's some really weird death animations going on. Imladris sentries surrounded by Trollman. Not the most inspiring charge, that. Managing to kill off a few of the Trollmen, but nothing too over the top. I still think Imladris will win here, but it will cost them. Will they have enough in the late game to be a contender, is the question we must ask. Just one of them, he was calmly stood there then, that Serpent's Fang. Imladris Sentinels. The sentries are a big problem because it means the quality of stuff like the Champions of Nafrat and the damage dealing capabilities are not going to be easily deployed, and they're also getting shot by the God Helem, so bloodied up sufficiently now, the champions. Melee defense never been Harad's strong suit. So as soon as those hit points are gone, they become less impressive. Those of Amenduia, are they setting up for a protracted siege here? Mirkwood are arriving. It'll be an uneasy alliance between Mirkwood and Umbar, I'm sure. Womb Raider has proven himself to be less than trustworthy in past free-for-alls, but the situation does call for some level of cooperation, otherwise Numenor, in the position that they're in, they briefly left the comfort of the corner, but no longer. They are back there now. Corsair infantry. I'm going to try and soften Numenor up first of all. Plenty of arrow fire. Do they have crossbows by any chance? Corsair crossbows would certainly be the sort of thing which would attract all manner of attention from all of the Numenor archers that are in a nasty position here, but regular archers will be fine for now, just to do a little bit of extra damage. Balagaya footmen moving in. They will stop the Corsair infantry from firing, but they've got a very limited amount of ammunition anyway, and especially with the armour upgrade, they can double as fairly effective light infantry, really. It says heavy infantry as the little parentheses unit descriptor, but I would argue that they are most certainly not that. Numenorean cohort and Naru sentinels, pikes go down. Seafarers moving in as well. Arrow fire being traded back and forth, but I mean, can you go up the other side, or is it literally only one route? It's possible you can't get up from this side, which is probably why Numenor is digging into this position so fervently. I don't know. You paint such a target on your back when you do this. It may not be Umbar that get you, but someone probably will. What's going on here? Bows of Amenduia. Starting some exploratory probing attacks on Imladris, perhaps, seeing that they are probably going to be victorious, and I think have been victorious, in fact, against Harad. There goes a general. It's impossible to tell whether that was the Gondorian one or the Runic one, actually. Yeah, Imladris victorious. There's that weird death animation again, still going. Imladris, much like Mirkwood though, damaged, so Umbar maybe we'll have to take the lead there. What's going on here? The gap from his routing. How did you get up there? There is actually no way to get up there, is there not? Yeah, there shouldn't be any way to get up onto that wall. How have you managed this? How have you managed to achieve this? Halberd in hand and all. Scion Rim. Yeah. I mean, as much as the Gondorian units here seem to be of decent quality, they are ultimately surrounded, and even the mighty Citadel Guard break and start to flee. Well accomplished this by back. Dragon's Wrath crossbows. Still alive as well. Rhun, I think, are actually in a pretty good position here. They will defeat Gondor overall, and then they're so far away from the main action which is happening in the south of the map now that they can get away with actually being out of the action for a long period of time, because they can just say we're transitioning over the map. But we shall see. Woodland Realm Patrol firing into the front line of Numenor, trying to give Umbar a little bit of a helping hand. Corsair Blackguards against Seafarers of Nindamos, two very similar units. I do prefer the Seafarers. I think the axe and the extra bit of damage that gives them does make them just a little bit more useful in melee for the kind of unit that they are, but ultimately it's a very small margins between the two units, exactly the same sort of thing. Achieved. Balakith Marksman as well. Alcarondas Legion moving forward, maybe being a little bit too stingy here on the front line. Narun Aru Sentinels taking a lot of damage under a lot of pressure. Seafarers are still there. Belagire Archers firing away. Alcarondas Faithful. I mean, that is a point. All of this melee cavalry that Numenor have is not really going to be all that useful in the given situation. This is the only way they can use it, which is when the line has a break, they can try and charge into it, but Lance Cavalry would be better at that. The Pharaohs of Nobles do have a slightly better charge bonus, so they would be the ones I would use perhaps before the Alcarondas Faithful, and maybe in the late game, if you do need to escape, the Alcarondas may be a little bit more useful on the open field than in this very niche role. Victory seems certain, still. Corsair Blackguards. Corsair Crossbowman as well in position. This is what I was thinking earlier on with the extra punch that those crossbows offer, and with so many targets now for Numenor to try and go after, 2 units of crossbows is exactly the sort of thing which will cause Numenor a fair amount of distress, honestly. There's still the small matter of Mirkwood hovering in the background with intent. Umbar are doing good things here against Numenor, I think, with a little bit of support from those Mirkwood archers, but it's not the sort of support that can be relied upon long term. Imladris are trying to scurry across the map into a more defensible position in the middle by the looks of things. I don't know whose cavalry force I would back still. Probably Mirkwood's, because I think the Sindar of the Girdle are a little bit healthier than the high tier Imladris cavalry at this stage, though Mirkwood are being forced to flee the scene. Mirkwood's cavalry will be more vulnerable to any sort of archer support Imladris wish to provide as well, which is worth considering. Imladris sentries will be really strong actually in this middle section of the map. I think this is the highest terrain that the map has to offer, now that I think about it. What's going on over there? Is that eagles? It is eagles. So this is what the hobbits were hiding in the backfield. Thrandir's retinue there. I mean, great eagles are especially devastating, as we have seen very recently actually with the battle on the Black Gate. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to have to be that if there's only one thing left, like one army left on the field that's very battered, the Great Eagles may very well be enough to win the hobbits the game. But if it's a decent force that still remains, then it's not going to be enough, really, is it? Elders of the Elven King getting into position, firing away into the Imladris position. I mean, much like Numenor, this does paint a target on Imladris, but there's less now in terms of opposition for them doing this. There are other ways up. You go right up to the top here. Looks as though you... actually, I don't know. I think these ruins might be in the way as a solid entity. There are many ways up, actually. Mirkwood starting to make their way up this way. Maybe if they can call upon the support of Rhun to go the other way, they can dislodge Imladris. But more and more, this of course means that Umbar are going to be left to their own devices against Numenor. But so far, I think they've done a pretty good job. With only a little bit of peripheral support from some Mirkwood archers, they've managed to push into Numenor territory. But in the end, will this strong defensive position pay dividends for Numenor. I mean, Numenorean Steelbow is going to do a lot of damage there. Harbingers of Castamere rolling forwards as well. Balakith Axguard, exactly the sort of thing which can help overcome the high armour values that Numenor traffic in, but I don't know about this. I don't know if they have the strength overall to continue this indefinitely. Umbar, Warlords moving in, Lance Cavalry's all well and good, but it's not really the kind of terrain that you can utilise them effectively in. And it's also where the Sword Cavalry of Numenor may come in handy, even if you are able to get them into a good position. Alcarondas Faithful there getting charged by them. The Rotten Meat and the Flies now buzzing around, though locked morale on the Ardenheim units for Umbar and very high morale on the Numenorian units, so routing is the sort of thing which is going to be uncommon between Numenor and Umbar. Interesting to see. I don't know, is this two? No, it's just one unit of Great Eagles, isn't it? A charge into the Sindar of the Girdle is quite bold actually, because the Sindar of the Girdle, especially with no melee attack on the Great Eagles, would make fairly quick work of the Majestic Flyers. Now then, Mirkwood, I think, will have been forced to back off from moving up this direction, so Mirkwood are going to go into the open field instead. You can see Rhun also appearing on the horizon after their good work against the Gondorians. That stone structure in the distance kind of looks like a sort of rock Barad-dur, doesn't it? Serpent's Fangs. Harad's still technically alive then, 10 of them. Will they be willing to commit what very little they have left to assist someone else against Imladris? I'm sure in the name of vengeance they will. What will Mirkwood do though? Mirkwood are the ones actually in the most interesting position here, because they've got a lot of decisions to make. Do they go after Imladris? Do they assist Umbar against Numenor? Do they assist Numenor against Umbar? Do they try and form an alliance with Rhun on the other side? That would probably be the most obvious thing to do, to try and lay siege to Imladris upon their hill. We shall see. Balakith Axguard shaken. Balakith units have decent morale, but they do tend to stick out for their ability to rout among the upper echelon of Umbar. And they can't really afford for them to rout either. This sort of armour-piercing surge that they do offer is a little bit too important for Umbar for it to just flee for the hills at this stage in proceedings. No matter. Over here, meanwhile, Pharazim Swordmaster's defeat is a distinct possibility for them, which I find hard to believe. I mean, Harbingers of Castamere have got more numbers left, so it's a sign that the Pharazim have been in melee for longer. They've also got support of spears around them, so they should be fine. Alcarondas Faithful from Umbar moving forward as well. Ardenheim Shield Guard, I mean, they've definitely thrown everything at one another. At the very least, I think Hatuma High can be pleased about the fact that he has not allowed Y2K to get away with sitting in the corner waiting for everyone else to do their business and then relying on a defensive position to see them over the line. Very rarely does this sort of thing work in a free-for-all. I can't actually think of any examples off the top of my head, but there's a first time for everything, but I don't think that's going to be here, even if Numenor refuse steadfastly to move after this fight has reached its conclusion. Mirkwood would probably fancy their chances of simply overwhelming the men of the island. Defeat a distinct possibility. And over here, Rhun, I mean, understandably perhaps, are not too eager on moving all on their lonesome into the jaws of the Imladris forces. What's going on over here then? There are units which are, yeah, they're just routing units though. You can see in the distance the Great Eagles. With this battle being one of teams electing to find a nice defensive position to try and settle down in, the Great Eagles are less useful than they would otherwise be, because if it is Imladris, for example, they're the last ones left, they're going to have the ability to bank up a unit of pikes or anything else to stop the Great Eagles from doing their thing. But we'll see. I mean, it's really not a terrible thing. If it was intentional, the Hobbits throwing the fight early on against Mirkwood, then it's not a terrible tactic that Medexa has decided to try and employ. The general falls. But it is a risky one, of course, because putting all of your faith into a single unit, even one that's as potentially devastating as the Great Eagles, is not the sort of thing which is guaranteed to work. Meanwhile, over here, Halcrondas faithful in behind enemy lines, though you can see now the melee fight is going the way of Numenor, so I think Umbar will ultimately fall, going the way of Harad. What is this little force over here? Some Imladris cavalry. I thought it may have been some Gondorians maybe that had decided to join us. There's still this one Gambreth. I still want to know how he got up here. Did he sort of get pushed up by the mass of the unit? I don't know. Either way, Gondor and Harad, the two armies which we can be fairly confident in not winning, defeated as they were by Imladris and Rhun. In come the Warlords of Umbar. Still a dangerous unit actually, with 12 of them. They can escape into the open field. Numenor's general is gone though. As I've mentioned, Numenor's morale is such that they're shaken actually. Loss of the general could prove to be fairly important here. Valakithak's Guard still doing their thing. Yeah, with the cavalry in fact, Umbar may very well be victorious, though they will only have their cavalry left to them. Their chances of overall victory are somewhat limited. Not the best charge, but not the worst. The Lancers did at least come down. Numenor and Cove were actually stabilised as a result of that charge. I'll never understand the arcane ways in which morale is calculated in this game. And surely it's only a matter of time at this point before the cavalry has its desired effect. The Numenorean Shield Guardian here maybe make it a little bit more dangerous. You don't want to stay in melee with Pharazim Swordmasters either. Heavy cavalry charges or no. And off they go. What's occurring here? What is Imladris doing here? Got Rhun up on that little hill over there as well. Imladris. Are they vacating their defensive position? What happened to the rest of their army? Surely that wasn't it. We have more than this. What trickery is this? What foul sorcery? Something foul is afoot here, I can tell. Cavalry is around as well. Maybe Imladris, in their weakened state, are going to try and forge an alliance with Rhun. Will there be betrayal though? Will they allow the Rune Raider to once again work his way to another free-for-all victory? Still the small matter of the Great Eagles, who are way over there, still loitering with intent on the edge of the map, which is more of an issue maybe for Rhun based on positioning at this point, and Rhun of course don't have that much cavalry. I don't think they have that much in the way of... Well, actually no, they've got a decently healthy unit of Scion Rim. The Dragon's Wrath crossbows as well, with a couple of volleys would be enough to give anything real problems. Yeah, you can see that Imladris and Rhun coming to an understanding, and as a result, yeah, the rest of the Imladris army is over here. One player admits defeat. Is that Numenor? Yeah, it must be. Numenor gone. And I have to say, actually, a little bit of support from Mirkwood, but for the most part, this was all Umbar's work. So, digging into the corner didn't really work out for Y2K, and also it wasn't really because he got overwhelmed by multiple armies either. Umbar doing very, very well, and there's still a presence on the field as well. High quality infantry, albeit in very low numbers, but cavalry as well. The Great Eagles are banking on a single unit of high charge damage, fast movers to be enough to win them the battle, so Umbar will also have to try and engage in this sort of thing. Speaking of the Great Eagles, very worth keeping an eye on them. What are they going to go after? After the Hobbits' demise early on, are they going to try and completely remove Mirkwood from the equation? Well, that's going to do an awful lot of damage there to a unit of Hiri Lung, which are going to be very important for Mirkwood here, given the precarious state they find themselves in. I think in terms of infantry, they certainly have the healthiest single army left, but surely that's not going to last too much longer. There's Imladris cavalry, there's Grey Eagles, which are mowing down some of the more exposed Mirkwood units that they can perceive. Hiri Lung charging downhill as well. Wands of Amon Lank lurching across. Flaming shots being employed as well. Spears of Rivendell. Tie up more of the spears, I suppose. Scion Rim, the Great Eagles. Are they still at full health? No, 2 of them have fallen. So that's something, I suppose. Wands of Amon Lank. The Elders of the Elven King still healthy. Bows of Amenduia going after the Gwythi Rockdoor after a charge. And after sentries as well. So can Mirkwood weather this storm? I find it hard to believe that they can, to be honest. I feel as though... Are Umbar waiting in the corner now? Have they joined the dark side? No. Warlords of Umbar getting hit by all manner of things. Warlords actually going after the Great Eagles by the looks of things. Not the worst idea. The Great Eagles represent a real danger, as we've already said, and we've already seen why. Absolutely demolishing a couple of the Mirkwood infantry units. Woodland Realm Patrol moving across. There's one Ent in and amongst a sea of low-tier Easterlings, though, so probably will kill a fair number of them before eventually a lucky strike does bring it down. Defeat seems certain. The Umbar General falls. The kind of units that Umbar have left, though, that's not really going to be too much of a factor at this stage. Rhun, with something like the Dragon's Wrath crossbows still in attendance, and with at least more of an infantry presence than the other factions are going to have. Will the Easterlings be feeling fairly confident? Gwythi Rockdoor moving into the back there, the Spears of Amenduia. That end did get taken down. There's all manner of routing units. It's impossible to tell in the background what is actually moving back to the fight or what is simply fleeing to their map's boundaries. Consolidating a little bit more over here, Mirkwood, though. Elders of the Elven King are still such a strong unit that maybe in spite of everyone grouping up against Mirkwood, maybe they will simply have too much left in the tank. Serpent's Fangs looping in a few shots, still trying to contribute here. If Harad were to win with 10 Serpent's Fangs, that would be a pretty wild time. Spears of Amenduia, balance of forces is evenly matched. Moving in as well, we have the Woodland Realm Patrol. Trying to overwhelm the units around them. Warlords getting charged in there. Thranduil getting absolutely demolished by the Great Eagles once more. Actually, Dragon's Wrath Crossmen is shaken. If they can be routed off, that would be a big miss for Rhun. And not only would that be good for Mirkwood, but also for every other faction other than Rhun, because you can't really allow the Dragon's Wrath crossbows to still be a factor here, and that charge should carry through to hit the Dragon's Wrath crossbows as well. Woodland Realm Patrol, they're stabilising now though, bloodied up as they are. We're into the final 10,000 frames here, and a lot is going to be decided. It looks as though Mirkwood have weathered the storm, actually. Everyone else not doing enough, and as much as it hasn't really paid off here for the Hobbit folk, the Great Eagles have been a real factor here in the late game. They do fall away now, one last charge into the Elders of the Elven King, but you have to say the margin by which Mirkwood were able to defeat the Hobbits in the early game was much greater than, for example, Rhun were able to defeat Gondor by, or Imladris able to defeat Harad by. Certainly, Umbar able to defeat Numenor by. And I think that's proven to be the key here. All of this cavalry could yet still have the desired effect, but at that point, who wins? Who's got the best unit of battered cavalry at this point? 6 warlords? 3 Gwaithir Rockdor, make that 2. Still a lot of woodland protectors though, a lot of spears. These strong crossbows are trying to peel themselves off the front line. And you have to say, that attack did not really work. Elders and spears still back here. I mean, 10 Elders of the Elven King at this stage in a battle is still a substantial force. There's still something in the corner over here. Is this where the Harbingers are still posted up? There's 2 Corsair Blackguards and 1 Alcarondas Legionnaire. That's it. Rockdor, a player admits defeat. That may very well be Rhun. I think they just routed off the last of their units. So the Easterlings, again, if those Dragon's Wrath crossbows had maybe been covered a little bit more, a few more volleys of them, I think we would have seen a fairly different outcome here. The question is, what is going to happen now? I mean, does anyone have a force that they have sequestered away that will reveal itself late on? Because if not, I think this battle has already reached its natural conclusion. Serpent's Fangs. Ironically, Harad are stronger now than some of the other factions on the field that probably assumed they were defeated. And I still think they are ultimately defeated. I don't think they're going to be able to win the battle based on the strength of 10 Serpent's Fangs, strong as they may be. Spears of Evanduia still in high numbers. 59 Wardens of Amon-Lank. Plenty of woodland protectors as well. What is even left? What is left? It might be time for ×2 speed actually. Based on how this has gone, I don't really see Mirkwood not going on to win at this point. I didn't realise how much the margins of the initial victory differed, but even with a combined effort, everyone else was not able to bring Mirkwood down. And ultimately, I think, you know, you're looking at Umbar and the like, and Imladris with the very depleted unit of Gwaithir Rockdor that they have at their disposal. But ultimately, there's not really much they're going to be able to do here. Density of spears, high quality infantry units, still here also. Not great. Not great for everyone else. Illidan. Elders of the Elven King taking pop shots. Yeah, it's going to have to just be a suicidal charge at this point, I think. Nothing else really remains. At this point it's just clean up. It's really just how long and how arduous the opposition want to make this fight. There's a lot of routing units in the background. A lot of chaotic routing has been happening all throughout the battle. Warlords do manage to give the Woodland Realm or Woodland Protectors the slip initially, but it's not enough of them at this point to make the difference. Only one of them remains. And they're going to have to leave. It's a bit of a weird end to this battle, considering we all know really what's going to happen from here. It's just a case of how awkward the opposition want to make it. They've already shot their shot really. Everyone other than Mirkwood. They all grouped together and tried to bring Mirkwood down and they failed. They still have a presence elsewhere on the battlefield, but it's not going to be enough. Player admits defeat, so that will be Umbar. Oh, hello. Well, maybe I spoke too soon. The hobbits did not just have the Great Eagles, they've got a second force that they had hidden, waiting in the wings. Is this going to be enough? I mean, Imladris would certainly think so. They're trying to go after the bandits. A few charges into them. So javelins from the bandits, high damage from the farmers of Buckland, numbers from the hobbitry and arms. Morale may very well prove to be a bit of an issue here for the hobbits. They've still got high quality units after all. The elves. Units such as the Wardens of Amon Lank and still those Elders of the Elven King. A few javelin volleys though. And with the peripheral support that Tommy is deciding to give Mirkwood. How the tables turn. Still a few shots as well coming in from the Elders of the Elven King. Softening the more numerous hobbits up for the kill. If there's any faction that can engage in this sort of thing, it is the hobbits after all. But a second hidden force. Very often we see free-for-alls decided on such things. Not willing to leave things up for chance then, Mirkwood. Not willing to give Harad the way back into the battle. The Serpent's Fangs firing away from on high, but the Sindar of the Girdle will surely bring them down. And actually the presence of the Sindar of the Girdle as well. 4 of them. Still proving to be important. Having a look, I mean, numbers-wise, yeah, those healthy units of Woodland Protectors, I think, are the difference here. Mirkwood didn't have them going into the late game. Things would look a little bit more dicey. Farmers of Buckland are very, very damaging, but Mirkwood are the sort of force that are going to be less susceptible to that kind of unit than most. Shots landing. The fact that they can continuously go back into hiding the hobbits means it's very difficult to actually force a skirmish fight with them because they can simply refuse, but these farmers of Buckland are still out in the open. So the hobbits are now moving forward. If they move forward as one, overwhelming Mirkwood is not impossible, especially if Mirkwood insist on staggering their force. I mean, every elf will count, so killing off these 4 for free is something that the hobbits will absolutely take. Spears of Amanduia. Louis Lung as well. Defeat. Mirkwood still not fancying their chances then, according to the announcer, but I still think like 55 Wardens of Amon Lank are going to be able to butcher their way through bandits, especially with spear support. Yeah, and now I think the announcer realises that. Woodland Realm Axemen getting in behind enemy lines, making sure that the farmers of Buckland and, yeah, bandits routing. A worthy attempt by Medexer to bring in hidden units for a second time, but yeah, the margin of victory that Mirkwood were able to achieve early on was maybe a little bit too high, which is a sign perhaps that the hobbits should have considered front-loading a little bit more so, or at least making that initial fight more favourable for them. Even if they ended up losing it, they should have made Mirkwood pay for it a little bit more. The use of the Hwatcher was pretty poor. So even in spite of these well-laid plans, the farmers of Buckland doing a decent job there at scything their way through one of the more exposed areas of this front line, but the javelins still raining down. Further back, defeat seems certain for the farmers of Buckland. Still the Gwythy Rock Door as well. The Imladris General is still a fixture in this battle. Mirkwood ever the fan favourites though, so I'm sure that this will be a popular outcome. Bandits. 98 of them do return, but now out of ammunition in their javelins, the Woodland Protectors committing to melee. The key, for the most part, in this late game dominance from the Sylvan Elves. Elders. They're going to continue to move forward, and surely the bandits won't last too much longer in melee given the fact they've already routed once. Easy to mentally unsettle a unit that has already fled from the field of battle. Of Amonlang did take a fair amount of damage actually there. The Farmers of Buckland are a savage unit, even if they do lack defensively in some ways, like pretty much all of the Hobbit roster does. Never really got to see the Proudfoot Protectors either, overwhelmed in that early Mirkwood dominance. It's been a weird kind of free-for-all this, but then 8-way free-for-alls tend to be, especially on maps that are as sprawling and varied as this. Not routing though, are they, the Farmers of Buckland? Stubborn. Times 2 speed. Will they be the last? Looks like it actually. Well, maybe not. One remains. There goes the Imladris General, killed off by a single Wooden Realm Axeman. So Imladris not managing to outlast the Hobbits just by a little bit. What else do we have? Trebuchet Crew, Hobbitry and Arms have returned from routing at just the right time to extend the battle by a small amount. But they're shaken by just one elf attacking them, so it's not going to last for much longer, is it? It's been kind of difficult to commentate over the battle in the late game because it's been fairly obvious throughout, even with the unveiling of the Hobbit units, that Mirkwood were going to go on to win it. It was interesting though because largely there were 4 1v1s that did crop up early on in this one, which is kind of rare for an 8-way free-for-all. Often you see a little bit more of a sort of all-in kind of approach from certain areas, but based on how people deployed, it kind of naturally fell that way. And so early on, there were several forces which ended up being, if not outright defeated, certainly heavily crippled. So the Hobbits and Gondor and Harad, and to a lesser extent maybe Numenor, because that fight dragged on for a little bit longer. And then late on you had the 4 de facto winners of that, but based on the margin of victory, like I said, Mirkwood certainly had the edge there, even though it was slightly intentional by the Hobbits. I think they could have executed the early game a little bit better. If that was the case, the Hobbits probably would have been the one to go on to win the battle as a result. But it's a sign that maybe keeping units back isn't always the way to go, because Mirkwood, of course, went all in early on, and that's why they were able to win so comprehensively there. And that was a decision which ultimately carried through into the late game. Captain Melon, interesting. But yes, so it was kind of very much a mixed bag for most people in this game. So for example, Rhun did very well early on, I thought, in the maze fight against Gondor. The armour piercing certainly helping them there, but in the end, they maybe have more of a target on their backs than many of the others in the late game from Mirkwood, purely because they have more left, and stuff like the Dragon's Wrath crossbows are obviously very, very dangerous. Harad, maybe if they had been a bit more aggressive early on, they could have overwhelmed Imladris. As it was, that battle went the way Imladris wanted it to, and they were still present going into the later game. Gondor will be fairly disappointed because of how the maze fight went. And yeah, obviously Umbar and Numenor. I think Umbar can be quite pleased with the way they managed to actually beat Numenor. They got a little bit of help from Mirkwood, but not too much, and not really enough to overturn the really strong defensive position that Numenor had. But Numenor also basically pushed themselves into a corner and gave themselves no option when things started to go a little bit wrong for them. So there is that to consider as well. But well played by Mirkwood, I think. Their early decision to go all in against the Hobbits, and then some good play later on ultimately was enough to win them the game. Speaking of which, Elves of the Elven King decent. The cavalry doing very well, especially the Sindar the Girdle getting over 300 kills. The background of this makes it kind of difficult to read, doesn't it? But several units getting over 100 kills, which in a free-for-all like this is not too bad at all. Hiri Lang maybe a little bit less impressive. Spears doing quite well. Woodland Realm Patrol, so yeah, as you would expect, Archers doing well. The Ents, pretty much all of those kills came early on against the Hobbits in that aggressive push, so you know, it is what it is. Maybe not as many kills as you would like to see, but they performed their role anyway. So yeah, big thank you to the Wound Raider for sending this one to me. It's been a while since we've seen one of these 8-way free-for-alls. So sort of, you have to make it as a custom scenario rather than it be an actual game type in the game menus. So it's a little bit of a pain to set up, which is why we don't see them a little bit more often perhaps. But it's always neat when they do show up, because you often see a little bit of a tangled web, even more so than a regular free-for-all, I would say. So yeah, it was good. Anyway, moving forwards, we've got a couple of other scenarios, one made by Tommy, which is going to be a Dol Amroth themed one. We also have a recreation of the Battle of the Five Armies coming up. There's going to be a little bit more in the way of Silmarillion. By the time this one comes out, I think in like mid-April, this battle will probably see the light of day. We should be marching ever closer to the release of the next patch. I keep saying that over and over, but it is worth saying that there is probably going to be a bit of a period where even when the new patch releases, there's going to be stuff from the old patch still going because of the backlog that I've established. But when the new patch does release, I do intend to do like a video covering it in more of a general sense, and then we could start getting on with some faction overviews as well. So yeah, big thank you to all the players, big thank you to the Wound Raider for sending this one in. I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.